a world where intelligence should be the only thing that matters, one student dares to challenge the expectations of an elite university. But when brilliance is ignored in favor of prejudice, what will it take to be seen for who you truly are? Let us know in the comments below. Debra Sawyer sat in the lecture hall, her posture rigid, her hands clenched around her pen so tightly her knuckles whitened. It wasn't nerves, it wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, the kind that settled deep in the bones, the kind that came from years of fighting to exist in spaces that refused to acknowledge her. She had been in plenty of classrooms like this before. Stiff wooden desks, harsh fluorescent lights, the low murmur of privileged students swapping weekend plans. But here, at Westbridge University, the stakes were higher. This wasn't just another class. This was advanced mathematical theory, a course so exclusive that only a handful of students were even allowed to enroll. Debra had fought to be here. She had spent her entire life proving that she deserved a seat in rooms like this. But none of that seemed to matter when Dr. Richard Alden walked in. The professor wasn't much older than 50, but he carried himself like someone who had already decided the world couldn't teach him anything new. Sharp eyes, graying hair, a crisp suit. Everything about him screamed tradition, order, and the quiet authority of a man who had never been told he was wrong. He set his briefcase on the desk and scanned the room with the slow, deliberate scrutiny of a man weighing his audience. His gaze swept across the students, barely pausing, until it landed on Debra. She knew that look. She had seen it 100 times before. A momentary hesitation, a flicker of something, curiosity, confusion, maybe even contempt, before his expression smoothed over and he continued speaking. "This class," Dr. Alden began, "is not for those who merely think they understand mathematics. It is for those who prove it." A ripple of smug chuckles moved through the room. Debra didn't react. She wasn't here to impress them. She was here because numbers had saved her life. Growing up, Debra had learned early on that the world wasn't built for people like her. Being transgender meant fighting for every inch of space, every ounce of respect, every breath of dignity. And when that got too exhausting, when the whispers became shouts and the stares turned into fists, she had numbers. Numbers didn't judge. Equations didn't care what name she had been given at birth. Theorems didn't ask her to justify her existence. They just were. And that was enough. Dr. Alden turned to the board and began writing. Complex notation spilled across the surface in rapid succession, the kind of problem that sent an unspoken challenge to the class. Who in this room actually belonged here? Debra's mind was already moving ahead of his chalk. The answer formed in her head before he even finished the equation. But she didn't raise her hand. Not yet. She could feel the way Lauren Matthews, a girl in the front row, tossed her hair and whispered something to the boy next to her. The way Noah Bennett, the only person who had even bothered making eye contact with Debra since the semester started, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She wasn't stupid. She knew how this would go. If she spoke now, it wouldn't matter that she was right. It would only matter that she had spoken at all. Alden turned to face the class. "Does anyone have an approach to solving this?" Silence. Lauren tapped her pen against her notebook, smirking. "Maybe we should let Sawyer answer," she said sweetly. "She looks like she's got something to say." A few quiet chuckles. Debra inhaled slowly. She had learned to measure her battles, to pick and choose when it was worth proving a point. But today, she didn't hesitate. She sat up straighter, lifted her chin, and spoke. "The answer is -17 pi over 6. The room went silent. "Oh." Dr. Alden's gaze flicked back to the board, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the kind of professor who was easily rattled, but Debra knew that look too. The look of a man who didn't expect her to be right. She could feel the air shift, the barely disguised curiosity from the students around her. Lauren's smirk faltered. Noah, seated just 2 rows behind her, let out a quiet breath. Dr. Alden turned back to the class, adjusting his glasses. That's correct. The words were clipped, begrudging, the kind of acknowledgement that felt more like an insult than praise. And then he moved on. No further comment. No, how did you arrive at that conclusion? No, impressive work. Just a sharp nod, a flick of chalk against the board, and the next problem rolling forward like nothing had happened. Like Debra Sawyer hadn't just proven herself in a room that was waiting for her to fail. But she had expected that too. Because for people like her, being brilliant was never enough. Debra kept her head down as she gathered her books, shoving them into her bag with a quiet efficiency that masked the fire burning beneath her skin. The class had ended 20 minutes ago, but she still felt the weight of Dr. Alden's dismissive nod pressing down on her. She had been right, and it hadn't mattered. The students filtered out in clusters, chatting about weekend plans, upcoming assignments, anything but the moment that had just passed, because to them, it had been nothing. To her, it had been another reminder that even when she won, she lost. You didn't have to do that, a voice said behind her. Debra glanced up, already knowing who it was. Noah Bennett. He stood near her desk, hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie, his gaze flicking toward the door like he wasn't sure if he should even be talking to her. Do what? She asked, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Answers like that. Debra let out a dry laugh. You mean correctly. Noah sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You know that's not what I meant. Of course she knew. She had known the second she opened her mouth in class. The moment the words had left her lips, she had felt the shift in the air. The moment she had been right, she had felt the resentment rise. Because people like Dr. Alden, people like Lauren Matthews, they didn't just want her to be wrong. They wanted her to be silent. Look, Noah said, lowering his voice. Alden, he's, old school. He's got a reputation for what? Debra cut in. For being a condescending ass? For making sure everyone in this department knows exactly who he thinks belongs and who doesn't? Noah hesitated, but he didn't deny it. Debra exhaled sharply, adjusting her bag strap. I didn't sign up for this class to make friends. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying, she interrupted. You're saying I should keep my head down, play along, let them talk over me and act like I'm lucky just to be here. Noah shifted uncomfortably, but Debra wasn't done. You think I don't know how this works? She asked, stepping closer. You think I haven't spent my whole life in rooms like this, in schools where I was too much of something, too smart, too stubborn, too different? Noah had the decency to look guilty. I know exactly what Alden thinks of me, she continued. I know exactly what Lauren and her little fan club are whispering about, but I didn't come here to shrink. She saw something flicker across Noah's face then. Something like respect. I know, he admitted. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The classroom was nearly empty now, the only sound the occasional rustling of papers from the students still packing up their things. Debra studied Noah's expression, the way his brows furrowed slightly, the way he looked at her like he was trying to figure something out. Finally, she sighed. Why do you care? Noah hesitated. Because I think you're probably the smartest person in this class. And because I don't like the way they treat you. Debra blinked, caught off guard by the blunt honesty in his voice. She didn't know how to respond to that. People like Nola, straight, cis, effortlessly accepted, they didn't usually notice people like her. Not unless they had to. She swallowed, pushing past the lump in her throat. Well, she said, forcing a smirk, if you ever want to cheat off me, at least make sure you're subtle about it. Noah grinned, duly noted. As she turned toward the door, she could feel him watching her, and for the first time all day, she didn't feel entirely alone. But the moment was short-lived, because the second she stepped into the hallway, Lauren Matthews was waiting for her. Well, if it isn't Westbridge's very own little activist, Lauren drawled, leaning against the wall with a smirk. That was quite the performance in class today. Debra didn't slow her pace. I don't remember auditioning. Lauren pushed off the wall, falling into step beside her. You know, she said, voice sweet as poison, you might find people a little more welcoming if you weren't constantly shoving yourself in their faces. Debra laughed under her breath. Right, because wanting to be acknowledged in the same way as everyone else is so loud. Lauren rolled her eyes. Don't act like you don't know what I mean. Debra stopped walking. And when she turned, Lauren actually took half a step back. Good, because Debra was tired. Tired of this game. Tired of the smirks, the side comments, the quiet but ever-present weight of being the only one like her in the room. You know what, Lauren? She said, tilting her head. You're right. I do know exactly what you mean. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough to make Lauren lean in. I know that if I were some frat boy who barely passed calculus, you wouldn't have a single problem with me. I know that if I walked into that room in a different body with a different name, Alden wouldn't have skipped a beat calling on me. And I know that no matter how many times I'm right, you'll always want me to be wrong. Lauren's smile didn't falter, but something in her expression cracked. Debra didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel and walked away, because she had spent her entire life justifying her presence. And she wasn't about to start now. Debra barely had time to set her coffee down before the first question was thrown at her. Miss Sawyer, since you're so eager to prove yourself, why don't you come up here and solve this? Dr. Alden's voice cut through the quiet hum of the lecture hall, silencing the scattered murmurs and sending every eye in the room toward her. Debra froze, fingers tightening around the edge of her desk. The challenge was obvious. There was no mistaking the sharpness in his tone, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long. She didn't hesitate. With deliberate movements, she stood and walked to the front of the room, feeling the weight of their stares pressing down on her. The equation on the board was a mess of symbols and notations. Dense, complex, deliberately chosen, not just a test of skill, but a test of worth. Debra met Dr. Alden's eyes for half a second before she picked up the chalk and started writing. Her mind worked in rapid succession, breaking the problem into smaller parts, isolating the variables, untangling the equation's intricate layers. She could feel the whispers behind her, could hear Lauren's amused scoff, the click of someone's pen tapping impatiently against their desk. She ignored them. She had lived in rooms like this her entire life. Rooms where people saw her first as a transgender woman before they saw her as anything else. Rooms where she wasn't given the benefit of the doubt. She finished the equation in under 2 minutes, setting the chalk down with a calmness she didn't quite feel. Silence. Dr. Alden took a slow step forward, his gaze sweeping over the numbers, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Then, without looking at her, he turned back to the class. Can anyone verify her work? Debra's stomach twisted. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. He should have either confirmed it or challenged it, but instead he left it up for debate, as if the truth of her intelligence could be decided by a vote. A hand went up in the back. Noah. He cleared his throat. Her answer is correct. Dr. Alden's lip twitched. And do you have a proof? Noah hesitated. I do, Debra interrupted. She didn't look at Noah. She didn't look at anyone but Alden, because if she so much as acknowledged the way the class had shifted, she might snap. She turned back to the board and, in 3 quick steps, proved the entire equation from scratch. When she finished, she capped the chalk off with a firm, final line and turned around. This time, Dr. Alden didn't immediately respond. The air in the room felt thick, like everyone was waiting for a moment that had no proper resolution. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Alden let out a quiet, clipped exhale. Take your seat, Miss Sawyer. She held his gaze for another second longer than necessary. Then slowly she did exactly that. The second she sat down, Noah leaned over. "That was insane," he whispered. She didn't respond, just took a slow sip of her coffee. Her hands weren't shaking. Not yet. The hall was empty by the time Debra finally pushed through the doors, her brain still buzzing from the confrontation. She barely made it 5 steps before she heard a voice behind her. She turned. Noah was jogging to catch up with her, his bag slung over one shoulder. "That was—" He let out a short laugh. "Don't even have a word for that." She arched an eyebrow. "Maps." He huffed a laugh. "Yeah, but like math with a vengeance." Debra smirked, the adrenaline finally starting to fade. "Glad to see I'm making an impression." They started walking. After a few beats, Noah shoved his hands in his pockets. "You ever get tired of it?" She glanced at him. "Of what?" "This?" He gestured vaguely back toward the lecture hall. "Having to prove yourself twice as hard as everyone else just to get half the credit." Debra's smile faltered. She had been asked that before, by other queer people, by other women in STEM, by people who understood the exhaustion of being questioned at every turn, but never by someone like Noah, someone who would never have to ask that question for himself. She studied him for a long moment. Then finally she shrugged. "I don't get tired," she said simply. "I get even." Noah let out another short laugh. "God, remind me never to get on your bad side." She smirked. "You're safe, for now." He bumped her shoulder lightly with his own. "Good, because I have a feeling you're about to make Westbridge history." Debra tilted her head. "What makes you say that?" Noah grinned. "Because Alden's pissed." And for the first time that day, Debra let herself smile for real. Debra sat at her desk, flipping through the dense pages of mathematical foundations. But she wasn't really reading. The words blurred together, the symbols losing meaning. She could still hear Dr. Alden's voice from class. "Can anyone verify her work?" It wasn't enough that she had given the right answer. It wasn't even enough that she had proven it. He had wanted someone else to confirm her intelligence for her. That was how it always was. The weight of being transgender, brilliant, and in a room full of people who didn't think she belonged, meant every step forward came with a hand, pulling her back. Her fingers gripped the edge of the book, pressing into the pages until the paper bent under the pressure. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She exhaled, forcing herself back to the present. "Yeah?" The door cracked open. Noah leaned in, eyebrows raised like he half expected her to throw something at him. "Please, tell me you're not still thinking about Alden," he said. Debra gave him a flat look. Noah sighed, stepping inside and dropping his bag onto the floor. "You're a damn perfectionist, you know that?" She scoffed. "Says the guy who voluntarily stays after class to take extra notes." "Okay, touche." He dropped into the chair across from her, kicking his feet up onto the small coffee table. "But seriously, you're going to drive yourself insane if you keep replaying it in your head." Debra leaned back in her chair. "That's easy for you to say." Noah frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Debra hesitated. Then she sighed. "It means you don't have to walk into every room already assumed to be unqualified." Noah was quiet for a second. "You really think they still see you like that?" She shot him a sharp look. "You don't." Noah exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "I mean, I know Alden's a dick, and Lauren's—" "Lauren." "She's worse than Alden," Debra muttered. "At least he pretends it's about my work. She doesn't even bother." Noah nodded like he couldn't argue with that. Debra's mind drifted to the hushed whispers, the lingering stares, the way Lauren had looked so pleased when Alden had challenged her in class, like she had been waiting for it, like it confirmed something she had been telling herself all along. "They want me to lose," Debra said, voice quiet but steady. Noah tilted his head. So prove them wrong. Again? She let out a dry laugh. Oh yeah, because that worked so well last time. Noah shook his head. Not like that, not just in class. I mean, really prove them wrong. Big enough that they can't ignore you. Debra frowned. And how exactly do you suggest I do that? Noah leaned forward, a grin spreading across his face. You entered the Westbridge Mathematical Grand Challenge. Debra blinked, then she laughed. It wasn't just a scoff, it was a full, actual laugh, because he couldn't be serious. The competition, she said, raising an eyebrow. The one Alden practically handpicks his favorites for? The one where the winner gets national recognition? Noah nodded. That's the one. She shook her head. I don't exactly fit Alden's definition of favorite. Noah smirked. Yeah, that's why it would be so satisfying to win. Debra hesitated. She had never even considered entering the competition, not because she wasn't good enough, she knew she was, but because she knew it wasn't meant for people like her. Every year, Alden had a chosen few, the golden students, the ones who had been groomed for this moment since their freshman year. Lauren Matthews was one of them. And if Debra threw her name in, Alden would do everything in his power to make sure she failed. Noah could see the hesitation on her face. You know you can win this. That's not the problem, she muttered. Then what is? Debra exhaled slowly. The problem is that even if I win, it won't be enough. Noah frowned. She leaned forward. Alden isn't just going to let me walk in and take this. Neither is Lauren. If I do this, it's not just going to be a competition, it's going to be a war. Noah held her gaze, something flickering behind his eyes. Then, he shrugged. So let's go to war. Debra searched his face, looking for doubt, looking for hesitation. But there was none. And for the first time, she let herself consider it. Really, truly consider it. Because if she won, if she dominated, it wouldn't just be a victory. It would be a reckoning. She smiled. Noah grinned. You're in, aren't you? Debra sat back, crossing her arms. Guess I better start warming up. Noah laughed, reaching out to bump her fist. And for the first time in a long time, Debra felt like she was playing offense instead of defense. Debra adjusted the collar of her blazer, her fingers fidgeting with the fabric as she stared at the giant whiteboard at the front of the lecture hall. The Westbridge Mathematical Grand Challenge was underway, and she was about to step into the arena. This wasn't just about numbers anymore. It wasn't even just about winning. This was about proving a point that had been ignored for far too long. She had spent her entire life fighting to be seen, not just as a mathematician, but as a trans woman in a world that saw her as an anomaly. And now, after all the whispered comments, the skepticism, the outright dismissal of her intelligence, she had an opportunity to take every assumption and shatter it in front of an audience that had already decided she didn't belong. The room was buzzing with quiet conversations, anxious competitors reviewing formulas in their heads. Across the hall she spotted Lauren Matthews, her lips curled into the same condescending smirk she always wore when Debra was around. Didn't think you'd actually go through with it, Lauren said, stepping closer. Debra didn't flinch. Why? Because Alden didn't pre-select me? Lauren scoffed. Because people like you don't win competitions like this. People like you. She knew exactly what Lauren meant. People who weren't given the benefit of the doubt. People who had to be twice as good just to be seen as average. People who weren't hand-picked and groomed to succeed by professors who never questioned their right to be here. Debra's expression didn't change. Guess today's the day we rewrite the rules. Lauren's smirk twitched just slightly before she turned away. Noah appeared at Debra's side a second later, his brow furrowed. You good? Never better, she said, cracking her knuckles. He gave her a look like he didn't entirely believe her, but before he could say anything, Dr. Alden stepped onto the stage. The conversations died instantly. Alden surveyed the room, his gaze settling on his chosen competitors first. Lauren, Matthew Green, Charles Higgins, before finally landing on Debra. She expected hesitation. She expected that little flicker of disbelief in his expression. But what she hadn't expected was the quiet glint of challenge in his eyes. He wanted to see her fail. He wanted to break her right here in front of everyone. And she wasn't about to let that happen. Alden cleared his throat. "Welcome to the Westbridge Mathematical Grand Challenge. You all know why you're here, so let's not waste time." He gestured toward the massive whiteboard behind him, where an unsolved theorem had been written in careful, precise strokes. "The first competitor to present a complete and verifiable solution to this problem will be declared the winner," he continued. "Collaboration is not allowed. You have 90 minutes. Debra inhaled slowly. This was it. This was the moment. A bell rang, and the room erupted into motion. Debra grabbed a marker and started writing immediately, her mind breaking the problem into its core components, isolating patterns, recognizing familiar structures. She wasn't just solving a math problem. She was solving for every single time someone had doubted her, for every time a professor had dismissed her answer before even hearing it, for every time someone had told her she was too complicated, too confusing, too different to fit into their world. She felt the weight of all of it as she worked. Her entire existence, her entire fight condensed into numbers, equations, logic. 30 minutes in, she heard someone curse under their breath. 45 minutes in, she heard a chair scrape loudly against the floor. Someone giving up. At 60 minutes, she knew she was close. And so did Lauren. She could feel Lauren watching her, could hear the frantic way her marker moved faster across the board, not because she was ahead, but because she wasn't. Because Debra had already found the path forward. A few students had stepped away from their desks to watch now. Alden remained perfectly still at the front of the room, his expression unreadable. 75 minutes. She closed the last gap in the theorem. Her markers slowed. Then she stepped back, and the room went completely, utterly silent. The answer was there, in clean, precise notation that no one could question. Her name wasn't next to it, but it didn't need to be, because everyone in that room knew exactly who had solved it. Debra turned to face the room, her heart hammering. Lauren's expression was stuck between disbelief and rage. Noah? He was grinning like he had never doubted her for a second. But it was Alden's reaction that mattered most. He walked to the board, examined the work, paused, then turned to the panel of judges. There was a long, stretched moment where the entire future of this moment hung in the balance. And then finally, he nodded. "The solution is correct," he said. The room erupted. Noah let out a loud, triumphant yell. Some students clapped, others just sat there, staring at Debra, like they couldn't quite wrap their heads around it. And Lauren? Lauren just stood there, silent, defeated. Debra took a breath, steady and slow, and let it all sink in. She had done it. Not because Alden had finally given her a seat at the table, not because she had been chosen, but because she had taken her place anyway. And there was nothing anyone could do to change that now. Debra stood at the front of the lecture hall, marker still in her hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. But for the first time, it wasn't heavy in the way it usually was. It wasn't the weight of expectation or doubt or the quiet battle she fought every time she walked into a room like this. It was the weight of victory, the kind that couldn't be talked over or ignored. Noah reached her first. He was grinning, full and bright, the kind of unrestrained excitement that she wasn't used to seeing aimed at her. "You did it," he breathed, eyes scanning the board like he wanted to make sure it was all still there. "Holy shit, Debra, you actually did it." She let out a slow, steady breath. "Yeah," she murmured. "I did." Lauren was still standing in the background, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin, colorless line. She hadn't spoken since Alden had confirmed Debra's win. Debra didn't need her to, because it was over. Whatever Lauren had been so sure about, whatever version of the world she had built where Debra Sawyer could never beat her, it had just collapsed right in front of her. And Alden, for the first time, he actually looked at Debra. Not through her, not past her, but at her, like he was finally, truly seeing her for the first time. Dr. Evelyn Price, one of the judges, took a step forward. She was one of the few people on the panel who wasn't handpicked by Alden, which meant she was one of the few whose opinion wasn't clouded by whatever biases had been running this department for the last 2 decades. "That was an extraordinary piece of work," she said, voice clear and confident. "I don't believe I've ever seen a solution written so efficiently in a setting like this." Debra's fingers twitched at her sides, unsure of what to do with themselves. She wasn't used to this kind of praise, not from someone with actual power. She stopped, swallowed, and tried again. "Thank you." Dr. Price nodded. "I imagine we'll be hearing quite a bit more from you in the future." Debra didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Alden cleared his throat. "Miss Sawyer," he started, and for a second Debra braced herself for something cutting, something designed to undercut her success, something that would try to make this moment smaller than it really was. But it didn't come. Instead, he just nodded, short, sharp, almost reluctant. "Congratulations." Debra blinked. That was it? Just congratulations? For a second, she didn't know whether to laugh or roll her eyes. Alden hadn't changed. He hadn't suddenly decided that he had been wrong about her, or that he was going to spend the rest of his days making amends for every single moment he had dismissed her in class. But none of that mattered, because he couldn't take this away from her. He couldn't undo what had just happened. He could pretend, later, when he spoke about this competition, that he had always believed in her, that he had always seen this outcome as a possibility. But she would know the truth. And so would everyone else in this room. She glanced at Lauren, at the way she was still stuck in place, expression carefully neutral. Debra could say something if she wanted, could throw every single thing Lauren had ever said to her back in her face. But she didn't need to. Lauren would have to live with this loss without Debra's help. "Come on," Noah said, nudging her shoulder. "Let's get out of here before Alden changes his mind and demands a recount." Debra snorted. "Not how math works, Noah." He smirked. "You never know with these people." She let him lead her out of the hall, the sound of murmured conversations and hurried footsteps fading behind them. The air outside was crisp and cool, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the stone pathways that wound through the university. They walked in silence for a while, Noah's hands shoved deep into his pockets, Debra's bag slung loosely over her shoulder. It still didn't feel real. Maybe because she had spent so much of her life preparing for losses. Maybe because somewhere deep down there had always been a part of her that believed that people like her weren't meant to win battles like this. But she had. She had won. And no one, not Alden, not Lauren, not the entire establishment of Westbridge University, could take that away from her. "You know what this means, right?" Noah asked finally, glancing over at her. She raised an eyebrow. "That I'm an insufferable genius?" He laughed. "That too. But it also means that this," he gestured vaguely, "this moment, this is just the beginning for you." Debra exhaled. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was just the first in a long line of victories she would have to fight for tooth and nail. Maybe it wouldn't get easier. Maybe she would always have to walk into rooms expecting to prove herself twice as hard. But at least now she knew she could do it. At least now, when she walked into those rooms, she wouldn't be asking for space. She would be taking it. Debra glanced up at the sky, let the sunlight hit her face, let the weight of the day finally start to settle. "Yeah," she murmured. I think it is. Noah grinned. Come on, you just made history. I'm buying you coffee. Debra rolled her eyes. Damn right you are. And as they walked, side by side, away from everything that had tried to hold her back, she realized something. For the first time in a long, long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next.